So I don't have a stalwart reason why I have to share this, but I think it's an important discussion to be having, particularly when something like this is still tender, still fresh, and you're navigating how to move forward with something like this. So, as an anthropologist and somebody who is interested in anthropological history, I think that it's important to realize that this is a discipline that has proportionately included women in it, albeit certain kinds of women, in a more equal ratio in the field than many other disciplines have historically. And it's also one that, for all of the immense faults and scars and wounds that are still bleeding and open in anthropological history, we do have at least a small space that has been dedicated to exploring what it is to be female-bodied in the field, and with our reflexivity about how that shapes the way that we absorb information, how that shapes the way that we are interpreting what accesses we have, how we feel things, etc., etc. So, in the whole brilliant world of feminist anthropology, archaeology, writ large, all of these elements, I think that there is, of course, a privileged discussion about equality in our job placement and in forms of respect, but I think that there's also always more space for any ethnographer, any person, to be able to sort of enumerate on their experience in a body in the field and how their representation shapes what they experience. So, I am an exceptionally privileged person, exceptionally privileged scholar. I am at one of the best institutions in the United States. I had unprecedented help getting there from my previous institution at CSUN, and help with the Mellon Foundation and mentorship that just achieved miraculous things. I come from, a lower middle class family in California. I'm white. I've been loved my entire life. I have any of the hardship that has occurred for me has been basically of my own choosing. So I traverse the world in a way that most people cannot. Again, disproportionately, I carry certain privileges that allow me access in ways that most people in the world do not have. And so I want that to be the baseline of this conversation, and in no way is this a claim of subjection and victimhood or anything like that. That's not at all what this is intended to be. But I do want to share a few things in regard to the not only just in the wake, I wouldn't even say the wake, in the pulse of the Me Too movement, and in some capacity, in some regard, what that allows us to do as people who have boundaries stepped over for various forms of our representation. It allows us to share stories. And Me Too is not intended to be, me also, exact same thing happened to me. I think it has to do with the integrity of it, and I think its initial power in its founding was the diversity of stories. So stories matter. And here's a little bit of one. So I'm about midway through my first preliminary stage of field work, and I'm doing a 2.5 month sort of, I hate to use the word exploration, but or investigation, those are both very clinical, but on a trip to various areas in France that have potential for me to be able to work there and do a long-term dissertation length research project there. And so I don't have a lot of mentorship in regard to being here. I don't have a lot of ties in regard to being here. So there's been a great deal of, what the fuck, this looks like a good place on a map, and let me go see what's going on. So in that process, of course, which I knew I would encounter, but of course it's always entirely different, you are constantly addressing your own representation and how you occupy space. And you're always addressing in what capacities you are um, changing narratives, that you are claiming some kind of spectacle because you're not from that community. You are not even disrupting, but you are shaping daily life in certain places. You are making people uncomfortable. You are uncomfortable, and often feel like the giant clown in the room with purple hair or whatever. Which again is a whole other notion about representation and how you relate authenticity without shrinking away and without pretending like you're somebody you're not. So that's something you're always grappling with. But in regard to a gendered body, I run into some interesting things. One discussion that I've had with many of my colleagues, mostly female, what identify as female, if it identifies women, whatever term they would prefer to use, we would prefer to use, talk about this idea of like desirability in graduate school. Many of us are in our early 30s, our late 20s. We're entering a dedicated lifestyle that sometimes is foundationed on other failed types of lifestyles. So many of us have had long-term relationships that broke up, broken marriages, other ways that we attempted to live a life that did not fulfill us, we couldn't fulfill it, whatever. So there is something about this idea of desirability paired with isolation that happens in field work and happens in graduate school. You end up being very specialized in certain kinds of language and certain kinds of thinking. You have a small pool of people around you who you're legible to in that sense. You may distance yourself away from people that you were close to before because your interests are very, again, specialized and have a particular set of languages associated that you become illegible to other people. Going on dates can be very bizarre because you're trying to find some kind of ground where you can engage intellectually, creatively, in a satisfying way, without isolating the other person through your language. So there's this kind of tight-roping thing that we're always doing. I think all people are doing in some way, but it's a new phase, or it feels very different because I'm in the early stages of graduate school. And you also don't have a lot of time for other people. So you, to sustain meaningful relationships can be very difficult. Having to apologize for your own success over and over again in your own life is very difficult. It can be extremely strenuous and, critical to relationships and can break them up. So, but at the same time, you're also feeling like you're floundering and like you're stupid and like, what am I doing in my life? And I'm illegible to people that I love. What's going on? The things that matter don't matter anymore. So then you also want not comfort, but you want human beings. And especially in something like anthropology, you're studying human beings. So you obviously care. In some capacity, you obviously care. Some have a more humanitarian aspect to it, which I think I would put myself into, whatever that term is supposed to be. But for me, this is an expression of spirit as well, and of respect. So it's an important thing to keep in mind there, right? Anyway, so you want to stay connected to human beings. You don't have the time. You're isolated. You're speaking a different language. You suck. You want to cry. And you want to be held. Whatever. So you take that in the field. It's just like blowing up 1,000,000% in my experience. And now you're on top of like my poor language ability in French. So then I'm even more isolated while I'm standing in a crowd. Like this, always the fluctuating relationship about these arbitrary notions of like being subjective or objective, or, am I part of the group? Is this communitas actually felt? Like all of this stuff, right? And so that's something I've been relatively comfortable in being uncomfortable with. However, to the point, I'm in Lourdes now. I've been here for a week. I'm going to be here for 2 more weeks. And this is an exceptionally unusual and vibrant city in a lot of ways. It's incredibly cosmopolitan. It's incredibly, I would say cosmopolitan in some capacity. It's quite an international city. Any given evening when you go down to the candlelight processional, you have various forms of dress, various people from different areas of the world, various languages being spoken, both in familial groups and then also over the loudspeaker when the prayers are done. Like it's fascinating. It's wonderful, and it's also this incredibly tenuous situation because you have literally thousands of people a day, a week coming through for 6 months, and there's potential for the state of vulnerability, of course, because this is a place of healing for many people. This is a place of miracles, which are improbable. So you have to kind of like suspend certain kinds of rationalities for the improbability of miracles. You're coming from different worldviews of what Christ might mean, religion might mean, all of these things, right? So these are very dear contexts of why we're here. So I think one of the reasons that the town seems to function so well, with so many people coming through, so few injuries, and also you're working with communities of people who are here for healing. So you have a lot of people who are infirm, you have a lot of people who are physically abled in different ways, and so there's a lot of potential for harm, and there's a lot of potential for danger here that I just don't see happening. There's a tremendous amount of caring. So I think part of that is predicated on this mutual respect, in some way, even under this like Catholic guise. But it's, again, there's so many different ways of relating to faith here, and explicitly different faiths. You have a lot of people who aren't even Christian who are coming here. So I digress. So we have this interesting thing where so many strangers are coming together into a space of worship, and they're doing it at particular times of day in a very interesting place, in a very interesting space to me, where it's not, and I think that this is indicative of certain pilgrimage contexts, and this is the only one I've experienced, so, but you have the church itself, you have church and its secondary church behind it, and certain kinds of services take place there, certain kinds of, how French can you get? Certain kinds of sightseeing happens in the church, but a lot of what occurs with the public happens in the square out front. There's a whole politic of, how do you work with keeping boundaries in places that are outdoors. And so there's some potentials that happen here that just let the entire brigade go by. This happens all through the night too. Like, where are they going? Okay. So there's something unique that happens something potentially unique that happens that I'm experiencing with the idea of the square, of the area outside of the church where a lot of people congregate, and there aren't really definitive parameters around that. There isn't like an intercessor, or there isn't like a priest. There's someone that we're focusing on. So it's really beautiful because all of these conversations can happen, and all of this serendipity can happen where it's just, a person happened to be down there at the same time you were, and you broke into a conversation. So that's part of where a lot of really beautiful conversations and sort of magical serendipity and happenstance seems to occur, which I love. And so I've been really enjoying going down during the candlelight processional about an hour before and just sitting on the bench, doing some notes, but really kind of just meditating, being in an open meditation, just watching, just chatting with people, just being there. And again, like, anthropology as a form has had a certain kind of quality about it that is of spirit to me. This discipline, whatever it might be, whatever the inquiry is about it, about humankind and these forms of sussing out sort of the delineations of culture and being as self-aware as possible in that, and having incredibly generous and truly loving professors. Like this has been very much like a process of spiritual nourishment for me, this discipline. And as this older student coming back to it, it's an extreme privilege to be able to kind of like worship in that, to have something be taken seriously enough that there's a discipline based around it, that humankind matters enough that we can seriously engage it as something that that's meaningful. So when I'm sitting down there, that's my prayer time also. And so something that has started to happen a few days ago was a gentleman sat down with me after family had left and sort of struck up a conversation before the processional. Is it going in circles? Okay. So something that has been happening recently is that this space is being challenged in the way that I originally had access to it, the way that I'm comfortable in having access to it, the way that I was understanding the space. And it is because of this. A few nights ago, I was sitting before the candlelight processional, and a gentleman came and sat down next to me and struck up a conversation. And this is exactly why I'm down there. I love this kind of thing. And he speaks enough English that we were able to have a fluent conversation. He's very, very talkative and excited about speaking his English. He speaks, by his own account, like 10 languages possible. And my understanding was that he was an attendant for the church. So again, very broken English. My understanding, and my very broken French, was that he, for a number of years, volunteered there in various areas, and again, he speaks multiple languages. He's working with different communities. So this is a really exciting conversation to have. I'm genuinely interested in what brings him back here, and what kind of spiritual food is there for him, and what kind of satisfaction is there for him, and what kinds of things has he seen, and it's important. But as time went along, it became apparent that he was talking at me, first of all, and he would not stop talking. So during the processional, which I found to be quite rude, he just continued to talk through it, and I stopped responding. And at one point kind of was like, but he would be like, and then just continue. And again, I have no community here. I have no friends. Every opportunity that I have to learn from someone, I'm totally down. So he asked about continuing to talk afterwards. And at this point, I was not deterred. It was just kind of like, okay, he's just excited. And he's seen this procession a billion times, so it's understandable. But he he talked about extending the conversation, and I was interested. So I said, why don't we, tomorrow night, we'll go and get a drink afterwards. We'll get a drink like right next to the cathedral. It's the Independence Day here, so there's going to be fireworks. I'm going to be out. They'll be out anyway. It's no problem. And in this conversation too, I had mentioned to him that he had asked if I was traveling alone. I said yes, but as a researcher. And he was asking if I was married. I said no, but I told him I was a queer person. And I used to wear a wedding ring when I traveled. And I made a very conscious decision a few years ago that was something that I wanted to challenge. And that the idea of this like specter of ownership with an imagined husband was not something that was authentic or healthy, whatever authentic is, but healthy to keep promoting, because I really and truly care about a world where women can traverse as freely as possible in landscapes as they choose to. That's really important to me. Everything of like revolutionary value that has happened to me has been because of my privilege to be able to travel and encounter the world. And I want that for whoever chooses to have that. So I decided to stop wearing the wedding ring just to see what was going on. As I've gotten older, I'm in kind of like a different sort of era of partying, or like being interpreted as such. So I don't get bothered much, which is great. But again, you get, people who are kind of like niggling and asking questions about it, and that's part of life and anywhere. It's part of my life every day, and and the rest of the world and back home. So I was clear that there was no romantic intention, that that's not an available option at all. And he said, all right. And so then he ended up walking me back, and I wanted him to walk me to a certain place, and I said goodbye to him there, and he continued to follow me. And this is a middle-aged man from North Africa. I don't feel in danger. I feel like I have relatively savvy way of making sure that I'm in certain crowds when I was walking back in a certain way. I have no problem with telling somebody to leave me alone, but I didn't feel that. So he walked me to my door anyway. I said goodbye, closed the door in his face, and I knew that I would see him the next day. So I went down the next day, same thing happened, and it was starting to rain, so I was like, let's see if we can leave the processional a little early. So on our way out, still fine, still comfortable, right? When we walked, he kept walking into me, and I didn't know if he was kind of a little clumsy, so I didn't know if this was just his own way of walking, if he has a different set of like proxemics about what's comfortable, what's not. I was literally, like, when I'd sit next to him, have my arms crossed, legs crossed, not even legs crossed, legs kind of open and crossed, so like very weirdly masculine, which I think is like anyway. And so we ended up going to get this beer, and we found a place where there was live music too, so that was nice. We could focus on it. And partway through, again, it feels very kind of like cordial. There's annoying things where, again, like he's walking too close, or he makes little like flirty asides, but it's just nothing too big. And it's also very clear. I told him a million times, And then I started making things up. I'm in a relationship. I only love women. I only all this stuff. So I'm like trying to give him reasons to behave differently, even though I've explicitly asked him without even having a reason not to. So in the United States, I'd be pissed, right? But of course, there's like this different othering that happens when you're traveling, and you're trying to be generous, and you're in other spaces, even though he's a traveler in the same space. So I just have this like over generous way of trying to assuage the situation. And at one point during the meal, I always wear this bracelet, which is an old earring, has a lot of value to me. He reaches out to grab the bracelet, and he takes like my whole hand in his, and he's asking me about the bracelet. And so I like take it off and I hand it to him, I like tell him what it is, kind of joking, right? And I cross my arms again. And then when he gives it back, he takes, again, my whole hand, both hands, and then he puts my palm up in his hand and does like the measuring thing, which to me is an exceptionally intimate thing. And I'm like, take my hand back, take his hand, put it on the table, and just pat it. And I'm like, no. And he goes, okay. And then he looks at me, he's like, not even a kiss? And I'm like, that's not happening. I need you to stop. And he's disappointed, but he already knew this. He shows like feigns disappointment. And I'm like, I'm over this. I'm over being nice. I'm super nice. I'm being too nice. So what do? I go up and I pay for the beers. So I buy this person alcohol. And then we go to watch the fireworks because I don't want anything sticky or uncomfortable because I know this person is going to be down every single night at the processional. I know that he is part of Lourdes. I know that I'm going to run into him all the time. So I'm trying to make this be as pleasant a situation as possible without alienating him or myself. So we go over to watch the fireworks. I have my arms crossed, shoulders up, whole thing. And halfway through, puts his arm around me. Take it off. Half more, puts an arm around me. And you know what I finally do? Is I let him do it. I let him just put his arm around me. And he's singing and dancing and having fun, and it's cute, and he wants to take a selfie, and like, it's joyful. And at this point, it doesn't feel sexy, but it's still like, I think it's an attempt to be friendly. But me taking my arm away, like. So the way that I chose to handle it was to let him do what he wanted anyway. So that evening, he walks me back, say goodnight, close the door. I'm just like, I need a shower, I'm over this. And it wasn't, it pales in comparison to many other situations that I've had in my life. And I've been extremely lucky in my safety and in how I've been loved by people. Like, extremely lucky. So this isn't anything new, right? But something starts to percolate. Go to bed and I wake up the next day and I'm angry. I am angry that I felt like I had to continue being nice to someone that I was explicitly telling my boundaries to. And I'm angry that it was so natural for me to do that and that it was the most reasonable thing for me to do in order to preserve my own safety, in order to preserve my own freedom in this place and how I traverse through space here and how I can research. That I had to have violations be legitimized on my part to the point where I bought this person beverage, I bought this person something to make it okay that what he was doing wasn't what I wanted. And I think that this is extremely relevant for all people who have these boundaries stepped over, as I mentioned before. And I think it's really important. So something that occurred during the Me Too movement for me was with really vivid, horrific, grotesque, brutal violations of women and of men and of trans people and of any other form of identification. It started to come out in these narratives about the Me Too movement that I thought, wow, I'm so lucky. Again, there's so many few things that have happened, and I've been so privileged to be able to be in loving relationships. I've been so privileged to be able to travel the world, and I've never been raped. Nothing like this. Like people have listened to me when I tell them no. But I think it's also really, really important to remember the ways that we condition ourselves to legitimize these violences too, which is certainly part of Me Too, and it's certainly part of education about battering and all other forms of abuse. But the way that I was able to twist this narrative to be like, it's no big deal, this guy, I've got to play it cool so that I don't get hurt more, so that I still have it. Having to negotiate, having to like swindle, having to finesse a situation in which I'm explicitly saying no. And I'm having to pay forward for it and pay my time and allow my boundaries to be stepped on just so I can keep going outside without being bothered by this person is important to remember. And it was shocking to me. This was another thing that happened, as I mentioned before, during discussions of Me Too when this first was coming out, was I've had numerous times that, frankly, I was violated. And because of my cultural narratives about boys being boys, or they didn't mean it, they were well-meaning. This was totally their well-meaning thing, that we end up becoming smaller and smaller and more desperate in the ways that we have to bargain to be humans in space. So there's literally nothing that I'm going to do to change any of this. I'm in a point where I have to think about, and this is just a small instance. This is just a small instance. I'm using this as an illustrative thing. It's just something that I've been milling about. And I haven't gone back down to the processional for 2 days. And it's partly avoidance. It's partly abandonment. And it's also partly to give myself some fucking space to think about this and how I want to proceed. And I'm lucky to be able to do that. I'm fortunate to be able to do that and find other ways I can research. But again, I think this boils down it boils down to, again, this discussion of basically micro violations that people have to endure in regard to their positionality and their inner subjective selves. And they can be nearly imperceptible, particularly, and they can be extremely volatile, particularly when you have been so enculturated as to continue feeding them, just so you can stay, just so you can watch people carry candles around without someone talking in your ear. So I think the reason that I'm doing this for myself, or if I show this to other people, I'm not sure yet, is just know that these complexities really matter and they have value. And as a scientific tool, this form of experience and these nuanced frissions of what it is to be a human being do nothing but enrich our understanding of one another in that way. So the more stories, the better. And the more ways of meeting yourself, the better.